Good morning to all. As part of our syllabus, today we are going to discuss about the topic of decolonization and the third world. So, third world means after Second World, or those who got independence from those colonial rulers, colonial states, they will call it as third world states. So, before that, now we have to know about the concept of this decolonization. Decolonization means the process of decolonization from the late 18th century became one of the essential phenomena in the study of international relations, because before First World War and before Second World War, there are almost two-thirds states are under the colonial rule. So this system, many states got independence from their colonial rules, and they fought against the colonialism. And after they got independence, they have become an independent sovereign states or modern states. So decolonization is nothing but the disintegration of colonial empires, which contributed significantly to the end of Europe's centuries long unquestioned international dominance and the disintegration of the European centric global order, because most of the nations under the European colonial rule only up to the end of Second World War. Even after Second World War also, many states are under the control of these European colonial rulers. So new non-European international powers like the United States of America assumed a dominant role in world politics and filled the political vacuum left by the erstwhile European colonial powers. In the former colonized world, political and economic asymmetries existed, and they acted as obstacles to put into effect many modern ideas like liberty, self-rule or self-government, rights and duties of individuals, etc. And also, no new states came into existence on all the continents because of the effect of decolonization. So, in most of the cases, the new nations adopted the financial, social, and political structures which were already in existence in the European continent. In the context of decolonization, the fabric of relationship among states was redefined and reconstituted. So, decolonization, which close links to European, become a continuous phenomenon in global politics. So, if we discuss about the basic meaning of the term decolonization, decolonization means in the study of contemporary political history, the word decolonization occupied a prominent place. So the disintegration of great political empires and the end of the racial hierarchy were the founding principles of decolonization, and these were widely accepted in political ideology as structuring principles of world order. So many international thinkers gave many different definitions. Traditionally, it's a process of delimiting a political rule which practiced subjugated relationship between the settlers and native people. Here, settlers are treated as alien occupants. So the studies related to decolonization look into from different perspectives. For instance, a historian, Prasenjit Duara, a historian and sinologist, has given less priority for the colonial empire's disintegration and gave more importance for native political power changes in targeted colonies in his studies. If we take an example of India also, there under the colonial rule of European rulers like British, French, Dutch, etc. Up to 200 years, India also one of the victim for these colonial rulers. So after 200 years, we fought against the colonial system and got independence from these Britishers. So decolonization is the disruption of the colonialism. Colonialism is a practice whereby a country is making its will and executing its sovereignty on foreign lands. So the struggle for independence was either intranational or supported by the external powers through international organizations like United Nations. So as we discussed, even after First World War, they have established League of Nations. The League of Nations also stands for the against this colonization system. So League of Nations also there for the establishment of independence for the colonial states from the colonial rulers. So those who are under the control of these colonial rulers, the League of Nations, and after the Second World War, United Nations organizations also works for the independence of these underdeveloped nations. We can find many decolonization periods in the modern world. For instance, in the 19th century, Spanish Empire was broken up after the World War I. German and Austria and Hungary, Ottoman and Russian empires got disintegrated, and after the World War II. So Italian, Japanese, Portuguese, Belgian, French, Dutch, and British colonial empires collapsed after the Second World War. So if we discuss about the process and methods of decolonization, decolonization is a process of getting political sovereignty for the colonies where violence was involved most of the times, and it's termed as revolution. So for instance, in French Indochina independence struggle got succeeded only through violence. So in the process of decolonization, there is a dynamic cycle. Whenever negotiations fail, minor disturbances happen, which lead to suppression of the colonial people by the police and the military forces of the colonial state. So it results in further escalation of the violent revolts that cause further negotiations till independence is granted to the colony. If we take an example of India, we are also started many struggles against the Britishers. Since 1857, we have observed a Sipahi Mutiny is the first independence movement for the Indian continent. So in India, many struggles, many incidents happen in both violent and non-violent method. So many violent methods happened during the before entering the Gandhiji into the Indian history. In independence movement, they have number of violent incidents happened, like Kuchora Chowri incident, and also many leaders like Bhagat Singh and others have fought against the Britishers in violent method. Many extremist leaders also fought against British rulers during the independence movement. So we will call it as independence movement, and they will call it as it's a revolution or rebellion. But we got independence from Britishers on 15th August of 1947. Like India, many countries fought against their colonial rulers during and after the World War II. So the process of decolonization is completed when the real government of the colony is recognized as a de jure sovereign state by the global nations. Getting independence of any colonized and subjugated nation is no easy task without the constructive support and encouragement of foreign countries. So in making of independence for the India, we also got support from the many nations after the establishment of United Nations organizations, because India is one of the founding member of United Nations organization. So United Nations organization stands for the against of colonialism, and also they fought against these imperialistic and colonial rulers. So there are many reasons why foreign countries try to help the colonized nations which are struggling for independence, like India and many other countries got independence after the establishment of United Nations organization. So the foreign countries will help the who are in needy for their independence, the nations which have identical ethnic and spiritual commonality might have empathy for the colonies, and also a robust nation might organize a de-establish a colony as a diplomatic move to weaken a rival and enemy colonizing power. So because of the League of Nations and after the World War I, the global opinion changed drastically for supporting the institutionalization of collective security to advance the reason for liberation of colonies. In the process of League of Nations passed Article 22, which created a positive impression for decolonization across the world. So the central theme of this article was to organize the colonies for self-rule. However, as a matter of fact, it was an arrangement of redistribution of colonies of defeated powers, mainly Germany and the Ottoman Empire. So the system had full powers to control and regulate the erstwhile colonies that were defeated in the Second World War. Even Japan also came under this system. The United Nations General Assembly in 1960 promulgated that all colonies be declared independent and sovereign. It expressed that the right to self-determination is every individual nation's right and declared that colonialism should be brought to an end as early as possible. After the birth of United Nations organization, the Trusteeship Council was given the control of the mandated territories, and it initiated the process of the decolonization of all non-sovereign countries. So after the got independence, they became as sovereign nations. However, this idea was opposed by the leading powers like United States and other majority powers like Britain, and opposed this situation. Due to that, the Charter of United Nations failed to express its strong solidarity to the freedom as their natural right. So the process of decolonization has taken off not because of any one of the act of history. It is a result of many movements of liberation. In every stage, the colonial powers fought relentlessly against the forces of liberation. So these movements may be electoral representation or autonomous status or total sovereignty. So the ultimate goal of the process of decolonization was get rid of foreign yoke from the colonies. So some of the decolonized states had been maintaining relations with their ex-rulers as equal powers. So even if we take an example of India, also we are maintaining our foreign relationship with our ex-colonial rulers like Britain and European nations. So these relations might be collective defense pact, training for personnel, military aid, and many more. So one debate is available in the studies of decolonization that countries like Canada, Latin America, and the USA were never decolonized. It is argued that it was the settlers and their offsprings who revolted and proclaimed independence, but not the indigenous and local people. So if we discuss about the decolonization process before 1918, the pre-1918 decolonization were the uprising of the 13 American colonies against the British Empire. So this event established the principles that individuals have the right to rebel against what they understand to be unjust rule. The USA just got independence from England in 1776. So before 1776 also, USA also one of the victim of this colonial rule from the European rulers. So subsequently, attempts made by some other colonies for gaining freedom from the British rule, and these waves movements to the British Empire. So, like British colonies like New Zealand got independence in 1907, and Australia and Canada got dominion status within the empire due to this policy. So, after 1919, though the establishment of League of Nations mandate framework, Britain extended its domains by processing Iraq, Palestine, and Jordan. So the powers that were granted to the mandates made them to exercise control over the territories. Till that time, they felt the territories were ready to granted self-rule. So the process of the decolonization also had its effect on the Ottoman Empire. Greece, which was a part of Ottoman Empire, got independence and was recognized as independent state in 1831. So the Greeks were assisted by the Great Britain, Russian Empire, and the Kingdom of France. So even French got independence in 1718, and Russians got independence in 1917. If we take an example of India, we got independence in 1947. Like many nations until establishment of United Nations, and after establishment of United Nations organizations also, many states got independence from their colonial rulers. So after Cold War means after 1970s, after the disintegration of Russia also, they divided into several parts as a independent sovereign nations. So after the establishment of United Nations organization, and after the end of the Second World War, we will who got independence, then we will call it as third world nations. So sometimes referred to as the post-colonial societies in political theory and comparative politics. It is important to understand the nature of the state in the third world, as it enables us to locate the role of the third world in international relations. So the concept of this third world refers to a group of countries with certain common features. According to some writers in international relations area, the developed capitalist countries constitute the first world, and the socialist countries are called the second world, and the underdeveloped countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America that were subjected to colonial domination are called to the third world. Some writers categorize the superpowers as the first world. The other developed countries like Britain, Germany, Australia, and Canada are clubbed together as the second world. And the third world consists of underdeveloped countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. But here, both definitions have few things in common. In both classifications, the attributes of the third world are one and the same. So the third world is defined in both the classification in relation to the developed countries. So the third world countries are economically poor and they have a colonial past. So even India also, we will call it as the third world nations. In the course of identifying the common features of the third world, one should not ignore variations among them. So some third world countries like Arab countries are very rich, while the others like Bangladesh are very poor. There are countries with democratic institutions. On the other hand, some third world countries are ruled by military regimes. So there are differences among the third world countries in terms of social formations ranging from tribal societies to capitalist societies. In spite of all these differences, the third world is not a meaningless category because it helps us in grouping together countries that came into being in fighting by against the colonial dominations. They all encounter similar problems because of their background. So hence it is useful to study the third world, keeping in mind both similarities and dissimilarities without exchanging one to eliminate the other. So there are certain general characteristics that the state in the third world has acquired, which may be attributed largely to the fact that they have been colonized, and the colonialism has introduced certain fundamental changes in their societies. So here there are different theoretical frameworks in which the state can be understood. So the third world states are to a large extent colonial creations, in the sense that their boundaries, the nature of their regimes have been deeply influenced by colonial policies. So these colonial rulers has influenced their colonies in way of education system, in way of food habits, or in their traditional livelihood also. So the nature of the third world state is analyzed in liberal, democratic, Marxist and new Marxist frameworks. So the third world economies are integrated into world economy, so which is guided by the principles of free market system and represent the interests of the dominant sections of the society. While they are dependent on the former colonial power, they also exercise a certain independence and mediate between the state and the metropolis. So the third world emerged in the post-World War II era in the context of international relations. So, and conditions when the world was divided into two opposite ideological blocks. That is, one is capitalist bloc, we will call it as United States of America, and the other bloc is socialist with socialist ideology, that is called as Russia. During those days, the process of decolonization was at its zenith, as a result of which many Asian and African countries got independence, and they joined international community as sovereign entities. So these newly independent countries had their own political, social, and economic problems, such as poverty, malnutrition, unemployment, overpopulation, economic backwardness, danger of neocolonialism, political instability and insecurity, and keeping aloof from Cold War by adopting non-aligned policy. So, and also they have faced social discrimination, illiteracy, etc. Many social issues also they are facing. So, with the view of this, grappling with these issues and to achieving economic development, they decided to pursue their own path. So they subscribed neither fully to Western liberal capitalist system nor a totalitarian communist system of East Bloc. So we proposed this non-alignment policy. So almost two-thirds of nations in the United Nations organization have been adopted our proposed non-alignment system. So non-alignment means neutrality. Neutrality means those who want to stay alone and should not join into those two ideological power blocks, nor USA or USSR. So neutrality, they should maintain neutrality. So that's what we call it as non-alignment policy. So if we discuss about the role and impact of third world in international relations, the third world countries changed the nature and the scope of international relations and made them global in true sense. They played a significant role in ending colonialism, racialism, bipolarism, and military alliances and Cold War, etc. They influenced the course of international relations by indulging in numerous regional conflicts on the one hand, and by launching regional organizations of cooperation. If we take an examples of regional organizations like SARC, Asian, European Union, and regional organizations like African Union. Many regional organizations have been established for regional cooperation. So their primary motto is to strengthen their economies by cooperating within their region. So they involved the concept of non-alignment and expanded in the form of a movement, non-alignment movement. So they strengthened the United Nations organization and influenced its working by their sheer numerical strength. Although there were several causes for the coming of detent, yet the contribution of Third World is no less significant. Third World has also given several new centers of power. So it also became first there are neo-colonialism and later a crusader against this evil by initiating a move for North-South dialogue. So to bring economic justice and equality, Third World is playing its role by struggling for new international economic order and new communication order. In this respect, the Third World's role has mainly been an opinion of mobilizing role, the goal of which has been legitimize the concern that they share among themselves and explore the possibilities of an alternative emerging out of such legitimacy. So these third world nations has been motivated and cooperated each other after they got independence from their colonial rulers. So there are several groups also there, and also after the establishment of United Nations organizations, many countries like India and other nations have started this non-alignment policy to avoid their dominance, which were call it as super blocks or superpowers like USA and USSR. They supported our ideology, they supported our idea of non-alignment movement, and almost two-thirds members of the United Nations members are following our ideology, that is non-alignment policy. So emerging the period of this bipolar world dominated by the superpowers, the concept of the third world offers different path for the developing countries. At one point of time, it acted as mobilizing force for the completion of decolonization on the other hand. So the Cold War also has enormous impact on developing countries politically, socially, economically. Cold War means there is no direct war between these two power blocks. Cold War means it's a ideology basis war against these two power blocks, Russia and America. So they had different ideologies, right? One America having capitalist ideology and Russia having socialist ideology. So those who are supporting these nations are directly involved, and these superpowers did not participate in the direct war. So, however, the end of the Cold War, the disintegration of the USSR in 1992 and the disappearance of the Second World have led to heated debate on the relevance of the Third World and the non-alignment movement. At the Third World and the group of developing countries enjoys continued relevance in the contemporary era as a reference point of development. The term has now been predominantly effective for the countries that face widespread poverty, population growth, the lack of industrial growth and development. All such countries together constitute more than one-third of the globe. Non-alignment movement provides a common platform to raise their voice. Third world nations no longer look to their former colonization, but the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. There are no permanent member to speak in Security Council on behalf of the South or the third world countries. So they are asking for the expansion of the number of permanent members by including India, Brazil, etc. Whether globalization will solve the third world's problem remains unclear. At the same time, to help developing countries help themselves, wealthy nations must begin to lift the burdens they impose on their poor. So, this is the concept of decolonization and the third world. So we have the syllabus of the United Nations Organization too. So the United Nations Organization is also established after the Second World War, and they started functioning. They started functioning from the 24th October of 1945. So many discussions had played to establishment of this international organization, because after the First World War, there is a international organization established for the protection of the international peace and international relations. So after the end of the Second World War, international relations play a very important role in bringing nations at peace and unity. So no country can survive alone in this universe. So therefore, there exists an interrelationship between these nations. So sovereignty of each nation is remarkable feature which establishes their identity. International peace and security is only possible when those sovereign are in cooperation, but that becomes a very difficult task as it involves individual power and supremacy. International disputes have been observed till time immemorial, starting from water disputes, boundary disputes or border disputes, illegal immigration and illegal cross-border trafficking of arms and humans, etc. The domination of super powerful nations over the less powerful nations has been marked in our world history with the outrage of many world wars resulting into massacre and widespread poverty. It could be summed up that power and its effect have had a very bad toll in our past history. So the remarkable step to overcome this difference of powers and unite the nations was to reconstruct the League of Nations to United Nations Organization. This progressive effort was made to ensure the main objective of the international relations. So the United Nations Organization established for the maintenance of peace and harmony, the development of friendly relations among the nations, and the peaceful settlement of international disputes or conflicts, and the upliftment of the nations deprived of the basic social economical necessities. So the creation of the United Nations during the year 1945 has been playing a remarkable role in achieving the objects till date. So the United Nations has its important organs into four. One is General Assembly, the Security Council, the Economic and Social Council, the Trusteeship Council, and also they have Secretariat. So the United Nations consists of almost 194 member states till now had binded themselves to be governed by the United Charter. So these member states have participated in this international organization, which name it as Peacekeeping Organization, with the very object of preventing the next world war. So the various principles under the charter itself provides basic rules to be followed by the member states that provides relating to maintaining of peace and security and harmony, the development of friendly relationship among the nations. So the members under the United Nations Organization act as one, which when it comes to global changes and its effects, cooperation between the nations has been encouraged. So the various success stories of United Nations itself we will discuss. So, before the establishment of United Nations organizations, there are several meetings held for the establishment of these United Nations organizations. During the Second World War, after the failure of this League of Nations, our international thinkers and international experts has thought that we should come together and to create an international, permanent international organization for the concept of peacemaking and peace protection and to avoid the war. So there are several meetings held during this time. In 1941, there is a London Declaration held, and in 1941, there is a Declaration of Atlantic Charter also is there. This led to the signing of the historic Atlantic Charter on 14th August 1941, while the Second World War is in progress. So the Atlantic Charter was signed by the American President Franklin D. Roosevelt and the Britain Prime Minister Winston Churchill. So after that, the Washington Declaration also made in 1942. The representatives of 26 allied nations and the Joint Declaration of United Nations in Washington. The term United Nations was coined by the US President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and it was first officially used in this document, the Washington Declaration. And after that, the Moscow Declaration happened in 1943. A conference of foreign ministers of the United States, Soviet Union, and Britain was held at Moscow. It confirmed the necessity of setting up of an international organization based on the principle of sovereign equality of all the peace-loving states or peace-loving countries, both large and small, for the maintenance of international peace and security. After that, the Tehran Conference held in 1943, the Dumbarton Oaks Conference held in 1944, and the Yalta Conference happened in 1945. And last, the San Francisco Conference, finally, the largest conference for framing the United Nations Charter, was held from 25th April to 26th June of 1945 at the American city of San Francisco. It was attended by nearly 280 delegates from the 50 nations. So the San Francisco Conference ended with the signing of the Charter of the United Nations on 26th June of 1945. So the Charter of the United Nations Organization came into force on 24th October of 1945 after it was ratified by the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, namely the United States of America, the United Kingdom or Britain, France and China, and the majority of the signatories. This was a beginning of the World Organization, and the first General Assembly was held in Central Hall. So we have to remember these 5 permanent members. One is USA, Soviet Union or Russia, United Kingdom or Britain, France and China. So these 5 P's, permanent members. So this was the beginning of the World Organization, and the first General Assembly was held in Central Hall, Westminster on 10th January of 1946, which was attended by the representatives from 51 nations. Similarly, the Security Council of the United Nations met on 17th January in 1946 in London. So the first Secretary General of the United Nations Organization was Trygve from the Norway. If we discuss about the objectives, present Secretary General of United Nations is Antonio Guterres. So He is ninth Secretary General of the United Nations to office on 1st January of 2017. So, if we discuss about the objectives and the principles of United Nations organization, the United Nations organization charter contains 111 articles divided into 19 chapters. So we have to know about the main principles and main objectives of the United Nations organizations are to maintain international peace and security, to develop friendly relations among nations, to achieve international cooperations in solving international problems and conflicts, to promote and encourage respect for human rights and the fundamental freedoms for all, to remove all threats to peace and ensuring better living conditions for people of the world. The main principles of United Nations organization are: one is acknowledgement of sovereign members, sovereign equality of all its members, and based on the ideas of peace, justice, truth, and fraternity. And also, the member nations must settle international disputes by peaceful means in such manner that international peace and security, justice are not endangered. So, member nations should refrain from threat or use of force against territorial integrity. So the United Nations is till now it is a stand for the against of this imperialistic and colonizing system from the member states. So if we discuss about the powers and functions of the Security Council, the Security Council is entrusted with several important political powers and functions. So its prime function is maintaining international peace and security in consonance with the principles of and purpose of the United Nations organization. In this regard, the Security Council submits annual as well as special reports to the General Assembly for its consideration. So besides this, the Security Council is entrusted and other functions also so the powers and functions of the Secretary General is the highest official of the United Nations organization and representative. The powers and functions of United Nations Secretary General are he acts as the spokesman representing the interests of the people living in other countries and continents, acts as the chief administrative officer of all the meetings of the General Assembly and the Security Council and the Economic and Social Council and the Trusteeship Council, performs such other functions that are entrusted by the other organs of the United Nations. And also, he is accountable for the day-to-day functioning of the United Nations, which includes consultations with world leaders, attending the sessions of the bodies of the United Nations. And also, he travels across the world to keep in touch with the leaders of the people of the member states so as to know about the various issues that are of international concern. And also, he submits annual reports to the General Assembly reporting on the work of the organization. And also, he prepares annual budget of United Nations organization, gets budget approved by the General Assembly, and that determines budget allocation to different organs of the United Nations organization for performing their functions, and also collects contributions from the member states. And also, he appoints the staff and secretariat as per the rules and regulations set by the General Assembly. And also, he brings to the attention to the Security Council any matter that might threaten the maintenance of international peace and security. So these organs also important. If we discuss about the role of the United Nations organization, United Nations organization adopts three major methods in order to perform the significant and foremost role of the maintaining peace and security. They are pacific settlement, collective security, and preventive diplomacy or peacemaking policy. So the first two are provided the Charter of the United Nations itself, while the third was invented by the UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld. So the peaceful settlement of dispute is the one of the predominant functions of the UN Charter. So in these methods, the methods and the technique of settlement of disputes decided by the Charter of United Nations. There are different types of methods are using by the United Nations organizations. One is negotiations. It's a process by which the governments sit across negotiating table and discuss the sort of their differences. So the negotiations are usually carried on either though the written communications or face-to-face dialogue or the oral communications. So sometimes an international conference may also be called for this purpose. And also good offices. The term good offices implies the state which is not a party to the dispute tries to bring the disputing parties to the negotiating table and facilitates the settlement of the continuous issue. And also there is a method using by the United Nations, that is mediation. Under the mediation method, the third party, either on the request of disputing parties or its own initiative, may assume the responsibility of the settlement of dispute or conflict. The mediator tries to reconcile the contesting claims of the parties of dispute. So the third party tries to suggest the terms of settlement to the disputants. However, they are not binding on the disputants. So, and also they are using inquiry and conciliation, and also they are using arbitration method. Arbitration is also a semi-judicial technique for the Pacific settlement of disputes, where the disputants refer to the case of an individual or a small group of individuals, and disputants state their respective cases either by an existing arbitral treaty or by a special agreement of the parties. And also they are using adjudication or judicial settlement. It is also a settlement of disputes between the states on the basis of international law by an international tribunal like International Court of Justice, the European Court of Justice, the International Tribunal for the Laws of the Sea, and the European Court of Human Rights and Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Here, the International Court of Justice is the foremost important international tribunal because of its jurisdiction, which you have read earlier in this unit. So, means yesterday we have discussed about the establishment of International Court of Justice during the time of establishment of League of Nations. So, the concept of collective security is an important aspect of this role of United Nations organization. So the collective security is a device of collective military action to maintain peace and order, to deter aggression. It is employed when the disputes have deteriorated to the extent of war or conflict. So the Article 1 of the United Nations Charter calls for collective measures for prevention of aggression and removal threats to the world peace. Similarly, the Article 38 and 38 to 51 of the Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter deal with collective security measures to be taken by the Security Council. The Security Council determines if there exists any threat to the peace, breach of the peace, or acts of the aggression. Accordingly, it decides the measures to be adopted for restoring peace and security. Subsequently, it takes into organizations the collective security measures and calls upon the disputant parties concerned to comply with the necessary provision measures of maintaining peace. And also, it calls for the ceasefire when the hostilities have actually broken out. This step was taken with regard to the fighting that took place in Palestine in 1948 and the outbreak of Korean War in June 1950. And also the Security Council is empowered to take forcible or non-forcible measures for maintaining international peace and security. It can call upon the member states to impose complete or partial interruption of economic relations or severance of diplomatic relationship with the disputing parties, so as to make them comply with the United Nations resolutions for maintaining international peace and security. And also, the Security Council is also empowered to take military operations against erring states with the help of the member states of the United Nations. Under such circumstances, the member nations are under the obligation to provide the United Nations with armed forces. They would work under the unfilled direction or under the command of military staff committee of the Security Council, which consists of the chiefs of the staff of the 5 permanent member states are their representatives. And also, the United Nations organization is maintaining preventive diplomacy and peacekeeping operations. The United Nations General Assembly innovated this peacekeeping technique in 1956. Its main thrust is not to defeat the aggressor, but to prevent war. So, act as a buffer and to maintain ceasefire. This was subsequently used during the number of crises with a significant degree of success. While peacekeeping emphasizes non-coercive activities to establish and maintaining peace, and the collective security stresses upon checking aggression through collective enforcement. Likewise, while the main intention of the peacekeeping is to prevent the interference of superpowers into a potentially explosive situation, the collective security measures could not be undertaken without the interference of either of the superpowers. So the peacekeeping forces maintain an attitude of neutrality and impartiality regarding the adversities, which is not possible under collective security measures. So the peacekeeping operations have been 2 types. One is which involved armed forces, and second one is which involved observers. Some of the operations and involved armed forces were like the Suez Canal crisis in 1956 to 1967, the United Nations Emergency Force involved in Egypt. In order to avoid clashes between Congo and Belgium, the United Nations Congo operation was taken up as a peacekeeping operation. And also, some of the observer groups were also there to assist the United Nations organization. That is, one is the United Nations Truce Supervision Organization operating since 1949 to report on ceasefire violations by Israel and neighbors, and the United Nations Military Observer Group in India and Pakistan, responsible since 1949 for patrolling the ceasefire line in Kashmir, and the United Nations India-Pakistan Observation Mission established to patrol the border between India and Pakistan during the immediately after the 1965 war between those countries. And also during the period of 1967 to 1987, the United Nations have responded to conflicts between Israel and Arab Palestine neighbors. And also the preventive diplomacy and peacekeeping operations has been established by the United Nations organization. Even ever since it became synonymous with the United Nations peacekeeping, the technique of preventive diplomacy is based upon the assumption that it is better to forestall conflict than to allow it to spread. All peacekeeping and related techniques have the same purpose. So there are defects also there in the structure of the United Nations, and also some of failure situations also faced by the United Nations organization. So in tomorrow's class, we are going to discuss our next topic is under Unit 9, unipolarity, bipolarity, and multipolarity. For today, I am concluding the session, and thank you for the participation. Thank you all. I am concluding the session.